under the rule of a single country rather than the division of the land that had happened messily and complicatedly in 1948. There was opposition to this policy. It was ineffectual. For instance, in 1972, there was a debate in the Labor Party on the future of the occupied territories. Again, Golda Meir asked that no decision be made at the end of this discussion. The finance minister, Pinchas Sapir, a major figure in the Labor Party, said that keeping the territories without giving the residents equal rights would put Israel in a class with, quote, countries whose names I don't even want to say in the same breath, unquote. But no decision was made again. By the time the Likud came to power in 1977, there were nearly 80 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. The Likud built on the foundation that had already been built. What was the United States, since I'm describing this from Washington, what was the United States think toward all of this? I think it can be summed up in two phrases. The U.S. was unequivocally opposed to settlement and undeniably distracted from dealing with it. After the Six-Day War, the U.S. became essentially Israel's sole patron. Before the war, it had insisted on the territorial integrity of all Middle East states. It continued to insist that afterwards. It saw the proper solution as the return of the West Bank to Jordanian control. But the war had shown that it was a failure, that the 56 arrangement had been a failure, that one of those undiscussed decisions that Saunders talked about was that an Israeli withdrawal would have to be accompanied by full peace. There was also a sense of great relief on the part of the American administration that Israel had gotten out of this war without the need for American forces to help it. And a secret memo written by McGeorge Bundy, who had been called back to the White House to deal with the crisis, to President Johnson said, laid out the contradictions in American Middle East policy, particularly the need to maintain connections both with Israel and moderate Arab states. But he noted that in order for the United States to avoid defending Israel directly, it had to make sure that Israel had the means to defend itself, and therefore it would be very difficult to use arms deliveries as a means of putting pressure on Israel to withdraw, because at the same time the United States didn't want a situation where Israel was weak. And remember, this was all going on during Vietnam. In fact, when I asked Saunders again about why the U.S. didn't deal more with the Middle East issue at the time, he said, you have to remember we had another problem on the other side of the globe. That's an understatement, obviously, about Vietnam, but it's true. As one Israeli strategic expert, Shlomo Bram, said to me in another context, you have to remember that attention is also a limited resource. And this is true of superpowers as much as it is of individuals. The United States in 1967 through 1973 was simply fixated on Vietnam. There was no room for anything else on the agenda. By the time the U.S. entered the process of Middle East negotiation after the 1973 war, the settlements were already a presence. Let us leap forward to today. I would mention one more thing about this, is that every time, this is a really important point, it's a good thing I didn't skip past it, every time there has been a slow-motion diplomatic initiative since 1967, it has led to an increased pace of settlement building. Many of the settlements can be seen as monuments to failed diplomatic initiatives, because what happens, two dynamics take place the moment that a diplomatic initiative begins. One is that the government itself wants to mark those areas which it's not going to give up, to mark the distinction on the countryside of what areas are available for negotiations and which are not. And the second is that opponents of giving up any land are going to speed up their efforts to settle in the territory as well. So, for instance, the first settlement was established in the Gaza Strip in late 1970, secretly. It was a response to the Roger Initiative of the summer of 1970, which brought a ceasefire between Israel and Egypt. There was a belief that, an incorrect belief that the Rogers Initiative would lead to a full-scale negotiating process. Key figures in the government wanted to make sure that Gaza did not return to Egyptian rule, and so they started the process of settling in Gaza. That has gone on right through the Annapolis process. The lesson of that, I think, is that the settlement issue cannot be left to the end of the process. The desire of diplomats meeting in rooms to talk about the issues and only deal with the facts on the ground afterwards inevitably means that the facts on the ground are more difficult to deal with afterwards. What is the situation today, or to work up to today? In the West Bank and Gaza Strip, in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, there were 116,000 Israeli settlers. This does not include East Jerusalem. The reason I'm breaking down the figures this way is quite simply is that that's how I get the figures. They come in separate batches and I'm trying to use the official figures because in this case I think they're the closest to being accurate. By 2000, when the process collapsed, there were 198,000 settlers living in the territory. When Olmert was elected in 2006, there were 253,000. Today, there are over 290,000 Israelis living in the West Bank, next to 2.2 million Palestinians by the best estimates. That is in addition to approximately 180,000 Israelis living in and next East Jerusalem and 16,000 or more in the Golan Heights. So the numbers keep rising. This is a quagmire because I describe it as a quagmire because it is much more difficult to get out than it is to get in. I don't think in Washington I have to say more about what a quagmire is at this point in time. Why is it so hard to get out? Well, I think there are several reasons that contribute to the sense of impasse in Israel today. One is that there is a deep, deep fear of internal conflict. In the summer of 2000, during the Camp David negotiations, it happened that I had a day of reserve duty. And I had to take a bus through the West Bank, and in front of a number of settlements, there were signs that said, "We won't leave here alive." Now, it used a Hebrew expression that could just be the alive. I don't know how to do this in English. It could be just seen as a word of emphasis. Like, by your life, we won't leave here. But it also means we won't leave here alive. And there is a significant and justified fear on the part of the Israeli leadership that an attempt to evacuate settlements could lead to civil conflict, perhaps including firearms. Civil war is terrifying. It's much scarier than external wars because it involves fighting members of your own society. In some ways, the Israeli leadership is, in fact, afraid of its own extreme wing. Second of all, the aftermath of the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 is perceived within Israel as we gave it back and they keep attacking. I think that this is a flawed analysis. It leaves out the mistake of a unilateral withdrawal, which was intended on the part of the Sharon government at the time to avoid negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas's government. Ehud Olmert, who was then vice premier, said explicitly that he wanted to avoid an agreement along the lines of the unofficial Geneva Initiative of 2003. But by leaving unilaterally, the effect within Palestinian politics was very much that it legitimized Hamas rather than Fatah. The opinion polls immediately after the withdrawal on the Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza Strip showed that the majority of the Palestinian public perceived that Israel had left because of the armed action of Hamas rather than because of a diplomatic process. This is certainly not the only factor, but one significant factor behind Hamas's success in winning a plurality in the 2006 legislative elections. But despite the fact that the analysis is flawed, I think that you have to understand what the narrative is on the Israeli side as a diplomatic fact. That is to say, what people believe is also part of the political constellation. In the academic seminar room, you can explore all the reasons why the situation is more complicated than that. In the political arena, the reigning narrative is one of the most significant political facts. It's as important as where borders are, where people are, whatever. It moves people. And the reigning narrative within the Israeli political context is that the breakdown of negotiations in 2000 showed that there was no Palestinian partner, and that the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 showed that if you pull out, you'll get rockets fired at you from there, so that if we pull out of the West Bank, it means that there will be rockets fired from Bethlehem against Jerusalem and from other areas of the West Bank against Tel Aviv. And there is a sense of, I think, that the prevailing political mood in Israel vis-a-vis the peace process could be summed up as "no, we can't," to put it in American terms. In this respect, by the way, it shows the strange symbiotic Siamese, the co-joined twins phenomena of Israeli and Palestinian politics. Nothing affects